headless priest, the guardian of the covenant. Part 2. The tension in the camp was palpable. No one trusted daylight anymore, nor the apparent calm surrounding San Gregorio. After the encounter the previous night, Julian knew they couldn't face the priest without clearer answers. He decided to visit the nearby village, hoping to find some clue about the legend that could explain the connection between the priest and the place. Lena insisted on accompanying him, and both left the camp at dawn, leaving the others with strict instructions not to enter the church while they were gone. The village was less than 2 kilometers from the ruins, but the winding, fog-covered path made it seem much farther away. The houses, with white facades and red tile roofs, looked deserted, as if time had abandoned them. There was no sound of rural life, only the whisper of the wind and the creaking of old wood. Has it always been this empty? Lena asked, breaking the silence. Julian shook his head. He had read about San Gregorio in his research. Although small, the village had an active population that lived off trade and agriculture. But now, it looked like a ghost town. An old man came out of one of the houses as the two walked through the central square. His face was wrinkled and stern, and his eyes studied them with suspicion. "You shouldn't be here," he said without preamble. Julian stopped, surprised by the man's direct tone. Lena was the first to speak. "We're investigating the church. We need to understand what's happening." The old man shook his head and stepped back, as if their words had awakened something dangerous. "The church is cursed. It always has been. You shouldn't have disturbed what was buried." "Do you know anything about Father Miguel Valdivia?" Julian asked cautiously. The old man seemed to shudder at the mention of the name. He looked around, making sure no one else was listening, then gestured for them to follow him to his house. Inside the house, the man closed the curtains and lit a candle, as if fearing that even daylight wasn't enough to protect them. "My name is Salvador," he said, sitting in front of them. "And yes, I know about Father Valdivia. My grandparents lived in San Gregorio when he arrived. They said he was a just man at first, but power corrupted him." Salvador began to recount what he knew, a story passed down from generation to generation. According to his grandparents, Father Miguel was a beloved spiritual leader until a stranger arrived in the village. He was a hooded man who never showed his face. No one knew where he came from, but his arrival coincided with a change in the priest's behavior. They say that man offered him riches and power in exchange for something. Some believe it was a pact to protect the village. Others say it was something much darker. Salvador continued. The tales spoke of a series of unexplained disappearances, children, women, and men who never returned home. The faithful began to abandon the village, leaving only the most devout behind. But the worst came when a group of villagers caught Father Miguel performing a ritual in the underground altar. They confronted him, but he was no longer the man they knew. He had changed. Something about him wasn't human. They sentenced him to death, but it wasn't enough to stop his evil. His spirit remained trapped, along with the church cursing anyone who dared disturb his rest. Salvador looked at Julian intently. "You've awakened something that was asleep. Now the Guardian won't let you leave. Until the covenant is completed, none of you will be safe." "What does complete the covenant mean?" Lena asked, uneasy. The old man hesitated before answering. "They say the priest awaited a final sacrifice, a life pure enough to break his bond with the Guardian and redeem his soul. But no one has ever been brave or foolish enough to try." Julian felt a weight settle on his shoulders. He now understood that they weren't just fighting a supernatural presence. They were trapped in an ancient game with rules they barely began to comprehend. When they returned to the camp, the situation was even more tense. Sergio and the others were arguing. Apparently, someone had seen a shadow moving among the trees, but no one had dared investigate. "Did you find anything?" Sergio asked Julian urgently. "A lot, but not enough," Julian replied, placing the journal on a makeshift table. "We have to go back to the church. There's no other way to stop this." The idea wasn't well received. Sergio flatly refused, insisting they should leave. Lena, though afraid, sided with Julian. She knew the danger wouldn't disappear just by leaving. "If we don't face this now, it will follow us, all of us," Julian said, looking at the team, hoping to find some support. The group was divided. While some decided to pack up and leave at dawn, others, led by Julian, began preparing flashlights, ropes, and any tools that might be useful for their return to the church. That night, as the moon faintly illuminated the camp, the shadows seemed longer, more alive. From his tent, Julian thought he heard a whisper, not in Spanish or any language he knew. The sound came from the journal, open on his table. The words, once faded, seemed to glow under the moonlight. "Only the innocent can offer what the condemned cannot possess." Julian realized then that sacrifice wasn't an option. It was a price someone would eventually have to pay. The air around San Gregory's church was heavy with tension. Julian, Lena, and two other team members, Isabel and Marco, ventured into the temple at nightfall. They had decided to return to investigate more about Father Miguel Valdivia and perhaps find clues on how to break the curse. The rest of the team, led by Sergio, opted to stay at the camp, insisting that entering the church was madness. The church looked gloomier than ever. The shadows cast by their flashlights danced on the deteriorating walls, and the echo of their footsteps resonated in the oppressive silence. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Marco asked, adjusting the strap of his backpack. "No," Julian replied, without taking his eyes off the dark hallway stretching out before them. "But staying without answers isn't a good idea either." They reached the underground altar again, where the carved symbols and disturbing figures seemed to watch them. Julian opened the journal and began reading in a low voice, trying to decipher more about the pact and the Guardian's connection. It says here that Father Valdivia believed the Guardian needed a pure soul to be freed from purgatory, but it's unclear whether that would redeem him or make him stronger, Julian explained, as his eyes scanned the faded lines. Lena pointed to an inscription on the wall they hadn't noticed before. The words were in Latin, but the message was clear. "He who awakens the Guardian will bear his wrath." "That doesn't sound promising," Isabel commented, trying to stay calm. A metallic noise interrupted them. It came from the hallway behind them. The group froze, their flashlights focused on the darkness. "Did you hear that?" Marco whispered, his breath quickening. "Yes," Julian replied. "We're not alone." The sound of dragging chains became clearer. It was rhythmic, slow, and each step seemed to draw nearer. Julian raised his flashlight, but the light barely pierced the gloom. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. The headless priest stood before them. He wore a torn black cassock and held a rosary in one hand. His torso was solid, but his neck ended in a dark void, as if his head had been ripped off. The figure didn't walk. It glided with an unsettling calmness, and each movement made the chains hanging from his wrists rattle. "This can't be real," Marco murmured, taking a step back. Lena tried to stand her ground, but the priest's oppressive aura seemed to drain their energy. Julian, however, felt a mix of fear and fascination. The priest raised the rosary, and the air grew heavier. A low, guttural murmur filled the space, a prayer in an unknown language that vibrated in their bones. "What does it want?" Isabel cried, tears streaming down her face. The priest didn't answer. He simply pointed toward the altar with the rosary, as if commanding them to complete something. But before they could react, a gust of wind pushed them backward, extinguishing their flashlights and plunging them into darkness. The group panicked. Amid the chaos, Julian heard a voice whisper in his mind. "The pact is not complete. Blood for blood." "Run!" Julian shouted, struggling to his feet. Guided by the faint glow of flickering flashlights, the group managed to escape from the underground altar and return to the surface. However, the priest's figure seemed to follow them. His elongated shadow was projected on the walls, drawing closer with every second. When they finally reached the church exit, an invisible force slammed the doors shut behind them with a loud bang. The echo resonated in their ears as they collapsed to the ground outside, exhausted and terrified. Back at the camp, the group tried to process what had happened. Marco, still trembling, broke the silence. "That wasn't a ghost. It was something else. Something that wants us to do something." "I know," Julian replied, looking grimly at the journal, "and it won't stop until we do." Lena, who had remained silent until then, looked up. "What did the voice you heard say? You said you heard something." Julian swallowed hard before responding. "It said, the pact is not complete. Blood for blood." The group fell into a somber silence. Julian's words made it clear that the Guardian was expecting a sacrifice and wouldn't stop until it got one. That night, as the others tried to rest, Julian sat by the campfire, reading the journal again. The words seemed to shift on the page, changing their meaning before his eyes. Then, a new message appeared, written as if someone had just added it. "The Guardian has already chosen. Prepare for judgment." Julian shut the book with a snap, his mind full of questions. But one thing was certain. The priest wasn't just a guardian. He was a judge, and his sentence was about to be carried out. The night at the camp passed in a disturbing vigil. Julian couldn't take his eyes off the journal, whose pages seemed to pulse with life, as if they were waiting to be read. Lena, Isabel, and Marco slept intermittently, waking up startled at the slightest noise. Sergio, who had decided to stay, paced back and forth, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, though they both knew such tools would be useless against the Guardian. When the sun finally peeked over the mountains, Julian made a decision. It was time to confront what he knew. Father Miguel Valdivia had broken the pact, but not without leaving a crack in the curse. Julian was convinced that this crack was the key to survival. As the group ate breakfast in silence, Julian began to explain what he had found during the night. The journal mentions that Father Miguel tried to reverse the pact before he died. There's a section where he writes about a ritual of redemption. "Redeem what?" Lena asked, her face weary but curious. "The pact with the Guardian." Julian flipped through the pages, stopping at a particularly worn note. Here it says, "Blood can open the portal, but it can also close it. The Guardian's will is not absolute if confronted with the reflection of its own damnation." What does that mean? Marco asked, confused. I think the Guardian isn't invincible. If the right ritual is completed, we might be able to stop it. But it also mentions something else. A price. Lena leaned forward, frowning. What price? Someone would have to sacrifice themselves, but not in the way the Guardian expects. The journal suggests the sacrifice must be an act completely opposite to the original pact, an act of absolute faith, something the Guardian cannot control. Determined to learn more about the ritual, Julian and the group returned to the church at noon. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the roof, illuminating crumbling statues and moss-covered pews. However, even in daylight, the place retained an oppressive atmosphere, as if time had been trapped within its walls. At the underground altar, Julian began searching for clues. Lena examined the inscriptions on the walls, while Marco and Isabel searched the chest where they had found human remains. There's something here, Lena said, pointing to a symbol engraved on the floor. It was a circle with a triangle in the center, surrounded by Latin inscriptions. It's a seal, Julian said, kneeling to examine it. The journal mentions this symbol represents the connection between the Guardian and its victim. If we break it, we might weaken him. Marco, who was examining the remains, found something else. A small silver crucifix wrapped in a blackened cloth. Is this part of the ritual? He asked, holding it carefully. Julian took it and examined it closely. Something was engraved on the crucifix. Ad fidem et penitentiam, to faith and repentance. Yes, he finally said. I think this crucifix is a key piece. Father Miguel left it here for a reason. As the group worked to figure out how to use the crucifix and the seal, a presence began to make itself known. First came the cold, seeping into the room like an icy breath. Then the lights from the flashlights started flickering. Do you feel that? Isabel asked, hugging herself. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed through the altar. Chains hanging from the ceiling began swinging, striking the walls violently. The figure of the headless priest appeared again, emerging from the shadows like a tangible specter. Julian raised the crucifix, trying to stand firm. We know what you did, Miguel, he shouted. We know you tried to break the pact. The Guardian stopped, tilting its body slightly toward the crucifix, as if recognizing it. However, the atmosphere grew heavier, and the rosary hanging from its hands began to glow with a reddish light. He doesn't like that, Marco whispered, stepping back. Suddenly, the figure raised a hand and pointed at Julian. A guttural murmur filled the air, and an invisible force pushed everyone against the walls. Julian fell to his knees, still clutching the crucifix. The seal, Lena shouted from the ground. Use the seal. Gathering all his strength, Julian placed the crucifix in the center of the symbol engraved on the floor. Instantly, the air seemed to vibrate, and a blue light began emanating from the circle. The Guardian recoiled, its figure trembling as if losing its form. However, before disappearing completely, it pointed at Julian again, and a voice resonated in his mind. The price will be yours. When it was over, the group was exhausted, but alive. The Guardian had vanished, at least for the moment. Julian looked at the crucifix, now cold and dull, and knew that this was only the beginning. We haven't stopped it, only delayed it, he said, standing up. Lena looked at him with concern. What did it mean by, the price will be yours? Julian didn't respond. He knew the curse was far from over. and that the Guardian wouldn't leave without claiming what it believed it was owed. Back at the camp, Julian began to feel a growing weight in his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, the Guardian's image appeared in his mind, whispering words he couldn't understand. He knew the ritual was incomplete, and that sooner or later he would have to face the true cost of the broken pact. Dawn brought a brief respite, but also an unsettling certainty. The struggle had only just begun. The camp at San Gregorio had changed. The already tense atmosphere had become suffocating. The team members barely spoke to each other, and when they did, their voices were nervous whispers. The appearance of the Guardian had left invisible scars on everyone, but especially on Julian, who seemed to carry a heavier burden. Sitting by the campfire, Julian flipped through the journal once more, desperately searching for something that could help them break the cycle of the curse. Lena, always by his side, watched him with concern. "How much longer can we hold out here?" Lena asked, breaking the silence. Julian didn't reply immediately. Instead, he pointed to a page in the journal with a Latin inscription, barely legible due to the worn paper. "Vigilantes viventium," he murmured, translating quietly. "The vigil of the living. This could be important." "What does it mean?" Lena asked, leaning closer to him. "I don't know exactly, but it seems to refer to a ritual to protect the living from the Guardian's influence. Maybe it's the key to keeping us safe while we figure out how to stop him." Before they could continue, Marco and Sergio approached hastily. Marco, who had always tried to stay calm, now appeared visibly shaken. "Something is happening at the camp," he said, breathing heavily. "What?" Lena asked, standing up. Sergio gestured toward the surroundings. "It's not just a noise or a shadow. Something is watching us. I feel it every time I look at the trees." Julian and Lena exchanged glances. They knew staying at the camp was no longer safe, but they couldn't leave without resolving what they had unleashed. "The Guardian is toying with us," Julian finally said. "He wants us to despair." "And he's succeeding," Marco replied, crossing his arms. That night, a new event shook the group. One of the villagers, Salvador, the elderly man who had told them the story of Father Miguel, arrived at the camp with unsettling news. "Tonight is the burial of one of our own," he said solemnly. "It's best if you don't come near the village. Restless souls tend to mingle with the living during nighttime burials." The group didn't immediately understand the warning, but Salvador insisted. "The church's curse affects everything in these lands. Tonight, the boundaries between our world and the condemned will be thinner." Despite the warning, Julian decided to accompany him to the burial. He believed he could learn more about the connection between the Guardian and the village. Lena, as always, joined him, while Marco and Sergio stayed behind. The funeral procession was a surreal scene. The villagers, dressed in black, walked silently toward the cemetery, holding candles in their hands. The only voice heard was that of the priest leading the prayers. Julian and Lena stayed on the sidelines, observing from a cautious distance. Suddenly, an icy sensation ran through Julian. He looked toward the trees surrounding the cemetery and saw something that froze him in place. A tall, dark figure, headless, watching them from the shadows. "He's here," he whispered, clutching Lena's hand. She followed his gaze and saw it too, but before they could act, the procession's candles suddenly went out. A scream broke the silence and chaos erupted. The villagers scattered in all directions as an invisible force struck the trees and kicked up dust from the ground. Julian and Lena took cover behind a gravestone, watching as the Guardian's figure slowly emerged from the forest, holding its glowing rosary. The Guardian moved toward the coffin, as if searching for something. Julian felt an immediate connection to what was happening. The journal had mentioned that trapped souls were used by the Guardian to strengthen its bond to this world. "We can't let him take that soul," Julian shouted. Lena looked at him incredulously. "And what are we supposed to do? We can't fight him." Julian didn't have a clear answer, but something within him urged him to act. He ran toward the Guardian, holding the crucifix they had found at the underground altar. He raised it high, hoping it would work as it had before. The Guardian paused for a moment, watching him without moving. But this time, the crucifix didn't seem to have the same effect. Instead of retreating, the Guardian advanced toward Julian, lifting its rosary as if it were a weapon. Suddenly, a blinding light illuminated the cemetery. It was Salvador, who had lit a large torch and begun reciting a prayer in Latin. The Guardian stopped again, its figure trembling as if losing strength. "Get back to the camp," Salvador shouted. "Now." Julian and Lena didn't think twice. They ran toward the path leading back to the camp, hearing Salvador's shouts behind them as the Guardian disappeared into the darkness. Back at the camp, Julian and Lena recounted what had happened. The group was more divided than ever. Some wanted to abandon everything and leave that very night, while others, led by Julian, believed they needed to push forward and stop the Guardian once and for all. As the argument continued, Julian opened the journal once more. On the last page, a new message had appeared, written in handwriting that wasn't his. "The vigil ends only with the truth. Prepare for what is to come." Julian closed the journal, knowing that the worst was still to come. If you thought the worst was over, you're mistaken. The search for answers has led Julian and his team to face the Guardian of the Covenant, a being who will not rest until its judgment is fulfilled. In this second part of The Headless Priest, tensions rise and danger feels closer than ever. But a new clue emerges. An ancient symbol that could be the key to stopping the Guardian, or unleashing something even more sinister. What does the medallion found in the ruins mean? Will the team complete the ritual before it's too late? Share your theories in the comments. Give a like if you love mystery and horror, and share this video with those who enjoy a good horror story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss Part 3, where the mystery deepens even further. Your support helps us keep creating these suspenseful and terrifying stories. See you in Part 3 of The Headless Priest. Part 3 will be available on February 8th.